So a warm welcome to this webinar where we will put the spotlight on the European Consumer Payment Report for 2022. We're going to highlight some of the key messages from this report when it comes to European consumers' look at the macroeconomic environment, also their prioritization in terms of household finances and their own financial situation. And my name is Anna Fall. I'm the Chief Brand Communications Officer at Intrum, and I will be your moderator today. If you have any questions during the webinar, just put them in the chat, and we'll try and cover as many as possible at the end of the webinar. If we can't find time, we'll respond individually to you. First on the agenda, I'm very pleased to have a colleague of mine here today, Anna Zabrodska-Avrianov, and you are Senior Economist at Intrum. And you will now provide us with some of the key findings from the European Payment Report. So, take it away, Anna.
Thank you very much, Anna. And warm welcome to everyone. And without further ado then, let's just jump straight into the discussion of the state of the European consumers, which I think is the topic that is more important now than ever in the recent past. As we all know and feel, Europe is now going through a very difficult time. We are facing severe economic crisis. We have inflation that has been reaching multi-decade highs. At the same time, wages are not catching up to the sharp rise increase in prices. And that, of course, is resulting in purchasing power dropping substantially for households, which has been pushing the consumer confidence to new record lows. Actually, the recent readings of those indicators really point out that we have consumer confidence even below early 2020 readings when we were in the depths of the pandemic lockdowns. And all of this uncertainty, of course, and volatility really forces kind of consumers to rethink how they spend their money. So they have to adjust their consumer patterns, but at the same time also to kind of make effort to really try to understand how inflation and interest rates are affecting their household finances. So those are really those key three topics that really stood out in this year's ECPR. And this is the consumer confidence, the inflationary pressures, and the financial literacy. So those are the key three themes that now I'm going to go into more detail. So the unprecedented sharp acceleration of inflation is really affecting people's well-being. And we see this significant rise in this bill anxiety. So now 2/3 of respondents really indicate that their financial well-being, but overall well-being as well, has been very negatively affected by the rising bills. And of course, this is mainly driven by the fact that we have a sharp acceleration in prices which are not being matched by the increase in wages. So the wages, of course, are growing as well at fastest rates than we've seen in past years as well. But unfortunately, they are not able to catch up to the increase in prices, which overall results in a very sharp drop in disposable incomes of households. And this affects consumers not only kind of their current situation and how they perceive their financial budgets and well-being, but also they're increasing the worries about the future. So in this year's survey, we had more than 60% of respondents indicating that they are really not able now to put money aside to ensure that they'll be able to afford comfortable retirement. And this is very big increase compared to what we've seen last year, and really the majority of respondents said that they have no issues with putting money aside to make sure that their retirement time is going to be comfortable. And it's in general not just retirement plans, but savings as such. So more and more people are being dissatisfied with how much money they're able to put aside at the end of the month after they paid all of their necessary bills. So this is not surprising that because of that, the financial well-being is actually decreasing. And 60% of the respondents to this year's survey indicated that they are currently worse off than they've been last year. Again, big increase compared to the results from 2021 survey, where we had less than 40% of people indicating that this is the situation. And of course, this unprecedented drop in purchasing power is really the main driver behind this phenomenon. We do see some differentiation between countries, and majority of respondents that indicated that they are feeling worse off were in Greece, Portugal, and Romania. But really, it's a broad-based phenomenon across the European continent. And only 7% of respondents really indicated that they do feel that they are better off than they were in 2021. Of course, it is important to note that 2021 was also a special year. We had the recovery from the pandemic. So at that time, I think optimism was also kind of more on the upside, while in the current situation, we see much more prevailing pessimism. And this, to some extent, is also driven by the developments in the energy market. This has been a very hot topic. We've all seen in the news, the energy crisis in Europe, and the energy bills really have been increasing extremely sharply across the European continent. The energy prices have more than doubled in European countries. Of course, there are various variations across the continent because it depends on the country's energy mix, on how the prices are being set up for end users, and how the governments have been intervening to support or to shield the households against this very sharp increase in energy bills. But even with all that, every third European is now stating that they are likely to actually default on their utility bill, which is a really massive share when you think about it. And in general, those consumers that say that they are likely to miss bill payments over the next year indicates that it would likely be in the e-commerce or online shopping bills. It's really more than 40% of respondents. And that's been followed by, for example, internet costs or internet bills and telephone bills. So I think the companies in those sectors should really be wary and monitor the situation, understand their consumers' ability to pay for their services. I think not surprising is that on the other side of the spectrum we have housing costs. So the rent and the mortgage payments are actually very high on the top of the priority list in terms of paying the bills. So to conclude on the consumer sentiment, we really have seen this massive increase in bill anxiety, that people are now struggling to really pay for their fundamental bills, something that they haven't really struggled with so much over the last decades. And the main reason behind that is, of course, the accelerating inflation, which really overpowers the rise in wages, and that results in this drop in purchasing power of the household. So that's, not surprising that inflation, again, is the second theme that really came up from this year's survey.
Yes, so thank you, Anna. And that's really a quite gloomy picture that you paint here, or that the report talks about. Moving into the second topic then, on the back of the extreme inflation, what impact do you think it will have on consumers' spending patterns and their ability to pay?
So definitely the fact that people have at the end of the day significantly less money in their pockets means that they have to readjust how they spend their money. They have to now prioritize some spending over the other, and think about how, where, and when they spend money. And it's not only today, but actually in terms of the expectations for the future, especially that we haven't seen the peaks of inflation yet. So going to the second theme, the inflation, actually, this is something that's not necessarily a new topic. Already in the last year's European Consumer Payment Report, that has been an important worry for consumers. At that time, we already seen accelerating inflation, but that was mainly driven by this very strong recovery from the pandemic. And the demand was very strong. People actually wanted to spend money. It was just the supply was lacking behind. Now the situation unfortunately reversed in some sense, that people might want to spend money, but they don't have that money anymore. And it's really broad-based across Europe. So now almost all respondents indicated that they are already being affected by the inflation, or at least they expect to be impacted by it in the very near future. And as I mentioned, we haven't seen the peak of inflation yet. It's still accelerating, and majority of, let's say, economists are forecasting that the peak will be reached sometime probably by the change of the year. But of course, consumers' perceptions differ somewhat to that, and a lot of them still believe that we'll see very high inflationary pressures over the next couple of years, and a large share, almost 20%, really kind of see this as a very risky development, that it's, we'll see those inflationary pressures forever. And that very much complicates the work of governmental officials, and especially of the central banks, because the central banks, in order to really fight inflation effectively, need to have this credibility that they're able to put the inflationary pressures under control. And unfortunately, it seems that the consumers are not necessarily believing in that. And that could mean that the central banks will be forced to keep interest rates high for longer, which again will impact the borrowing costs and economic outlook even further for years to come. But I think it's important to note that we have very dynamic economic situation. And now Europe is entering period of the slowdown. We already started seeing that in the second half of this year, especially in the Q3 GDP results. And now it is believed that Europe might be entering or might be heading towards recession. Probably not all countries, but at least some of the key economies will be entering recession at the turn of the year. For example, Germany, Italy are believed to be heading there quite soon. And that, of course, should put a downward pressure on prices when we have those recessionary environments. So now it's mostly believed that we should start seeing the inflation rate to start kind of decelerating. So the prices are still going to increase, but at the slower and slower rates, most likely in the second half of next year. And the normalization really should come probably by the end of 2024. Again, there are going to be some differences between European geographies. In some countries, it's going to come sooner, for others later. But we should see that normalization within the 2.5 year horizon. But I think it is important to note that the times of ultra-low inflation and ultra-low interest rates, what we've seen over the last 15, even maybe 20 years, are behind us. So these are really unlikely to come back. So when we talk about normalization, we still think about inflation kind of higher than what we've been used to for some generations especially. And because of that, as we mentioned, Anna, that this acceleration of inflation is really forcing consumers to start adjusting how they spend their money. And first of all, what comes kind of in the first line in terms of expenses is that they're cutting this kind of social activities. So more than 50% of the respondents indicated that are actually cutting down or, for example, going to restaurants, on meals with friends outside, and then also on shopping. So especially now they're focusing more on kind of discount stores rather than big retail brands. So, of course, that is really affecting the sectors such as hospitality, retail, those ones where they're very much strongly hit by the pandemic. And in many cases, businesses in those sectors still did not manage to recover completely. So, unfortunately, with this secondary hit to their balance sheets, we might see a rise in insolvencies for the companies in these two sectors. What also is important, I think, when we talk about consumer spending is the sustainable aspect of it. Because over the last years, we've really seen an increased focus on sustainable services and goods. And this year, the survey really showed that, unfortunately, this topic has really kind of dropped on the agenda and on the priorities of consumers. And that's simply because those sustainable goods and services are very often too pricey for consumers in this current situation. At the same time, it's not like the kind of the theme is forgotten completely. It's still important for consumers, and they do indicate that they'll be willing to immediately stop buying from companies if they believe that the company is, for example, discriminating against its consumers because of their background. So while consumers might not be able to spend money on sustainable products and services, they're at least kind of deselecting the unsustainable ones. So to summarize on the inflationary pressures, I mean, we see them broad-based across the continent. They have been accelerating extremely sharply. Inflation rates have reached multi-decade highs, something that we haven't really seen for some generations even. And it's really affecting how people are able to spend their money. So they need to start prioritizing their budget, and they need to also start understanding how inflation and interest rates, for example, affect their private finances. And that's where this issue of financial literacy, again, come into light, which is an area that I think over the last years really has been a little bit forgotten.
Thank you. And I mean, talking about financial literacy in this kind of gloomy macroeconomic context, it goes up on the agenda. And what does this year's report, the ECPR, show when it comes to consumers' understanding of basic financial concepts?
So I think exactly that, as you mentioned, it really means that for now, the consumers are realizing that they need to understand those economic themes or concepts much better to be able to make the best choices for their budgets, for how they can spend their money, and what does it mean for their private finances. But unfortunately, it's still lagging behind. So we still, in our responses, saw that there is still definitely a lot of work that needs to be done in this area. And in particular, as I mentioned to you, we do see that consumers are being proactive in terms of trying to understand and kind of take their budgets under control and understand their private finances. So we see that they increase in actions to try to, for example, talk to their family and friends about financial matters, which is something that, sometimes it's a taboo in the past, but now it's really becoming the forefront of the conversations. And also people start to plan their budget. So I think they start to plan their expenses, not just going on a whim and spend a lot of big amounts of money suddenly. So they are really increasingly adopting those positive and especially future-focused steps to control the budgets. But unfortunately, as I mentioned to you, Anna, the progress is uneven, and still most admit that they are in the dark when it comes to understanding those kind of how the financial concepts really influence their private finances. And just to give you an example, we had over 50% of respondents not being able to answer correctly to the question, if you have a utility bill of 200 euros today, how it would increase in the 2-year horizon when we assume inflation of 5%. So this is relatively simple compound interest question, and still more than half of respondents were not able to answer that. And what we've seen from the data coming from this survey is that financial literacy in those difficult economic times are really key to ensure that you manage to weather those storms as efficiently as possible. So among people that did show that their financial literacy is poor, that their financial education is weak, 70% of them indicated that they are now worse off than they were a year ago. And that share actually dropped below 50% for those with good financial education. So that really shows that, there is a big difference. So you have to really understand economic concepts or financial concepts to make sure that you can really make the most well-adjusted decision and kind of maintain your sustainable household finances. So this is really all from my side. I don't want to end, on the old doom and gloom situation. I think it's really important to note that, this is as I call a cycle. So yes, we are currently in kind of a difficult economic situation, but that means that, we will have recovery and expansion coming after that. That being said, we do have to acknowledge, and consumers have to acknowledge, that at least the next 6 months or the near term are going to be difficult. That, as I mentioned before, we still have not seen peaks of inflation. So, the inflation and interest rates are still kind of key concepts that should be understood, because they're really going to be affecting household budgets in the near term. So I think, this financial literacy, as I mentioned, is really key to make sure that we have sustainable finances and that the economies are efficient, which would allow, also for businesses to grow and thrive. And this is something where, we as a business are definitely committed to lead the way. So thank you very much for your attention. And that's all from my side.
Thank you, Anna. We'll actually keep you for the panel. But that was a really interesting presentation. And it's worth mentioning, this is highlights really from the report. And tomorrow, the 24th of November, we will release the full report, and you will actually get an email into your inboxes. So by that, I'm delighted to invite some more panelists to stage. And I will start with Beatrice Widmark. Welcome. You are a behavioral science consultant. What an exciting title at Whateverland.
Yes.
And you help companies understand customers' behaviors and how to engage and positively impact on their behaviors and well-being. Is that a correct description?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank
Fantastic. And then we have Jan Hansson from Klarna with us, Vice President of Debt Collection. And you've spent 13 years with Klarna, and you have a long and strong background in the industry.
Yep.
Warm welcome.
Thank you.
And then I'm very pleased to also have a colleague of mine connected online from the UK, Eddie Knott, who is our Managing Director for UK and Ireland. Hi, Eddie. How are you today?
Hi, Anna. Fine, thank you.
And you said it's pouring rain in the UK. Oh.
As always.
It's a great and strong panel, and I thought we'd start off with talking about consumer confidence, and I turn to you, Beatrice. So how would you say consumers act when they are facing economics uncertainties as we have in front of us today?
Yes, indeed. And when we feel financially uncertain, it becomes a big stressor in our life. So we can become very stressed. And what we tend to do when we are stressed is to become more present focused. So we want to regain the control we can. So and as the Intrum report showed, was that many people are cutting back on the more unnecessary expenses like eating out and doing all these social activities. And that's a very, very common reaction when people are facing uncertainty, that they do everything they can to like manage their finances right now. But it can also, when we are under stress, we can also make a bit impulsive and hasty decisions too. So we can, for instance, sell our funds and shares. That's a very classic example when we see the stock market go down. So we can also make decisions that are good, that we feel are good for us now, but aren't the best in the long term.
Sounds natural.
Yeah.
Anna, at what pace are bills increasing, really? And how does this compare to salary increases?
So of course, there are big variations across countries, but we do see that the bills as inflation have definitely been outpacing the wages growth. So the wages have been growing and have accelerated compared to the last years, but it's really not able to overcompensate for this massive increase in kind of living costs that we see currently. So that's why now European consumers are really faced with this living costs or living standard crisis because they're just not able to afford what they were used to be able to afford, just a year ago.
Thank you. And then I turn to you, Eddie. You're in the middle of consumers' worries, etc. And how do you think they are prioritizing between the different bills, and why so? What's your view?
Yeah, well, I think 80% of European consumers are worried about their energy bills, and as we might imagine, but also 80% of people are worried about their food bills and the ability to be able to save in future because of the rising cost of food. And in fact, in France and the UK, 1 in 3 expect they won't be able to pay their utility bills in the next 12 months, which is actually quite a scary statistic. What we are seeing is a couple of trends in what customers are doing. They're obviously prioritising housing, and they're prioritising eating, which you could imagine is the right thing to do. A couple of things they're doing, though, they're asking their creditors for longer payment terms. We see some of the millennials using buy now, pay later, like the Klarna, that we see 1 in 3 in our survey across Europe said of Generation Z said that they would actually use buy now, pay later more because they can stretch their payment terms. We clearly see reduced discretionary spending. We're already seeing that. And the other thing we're also seeing is customers being canny about how they spend their money. So we're seeing in the UK basket sizes in supermarkets flat, despite 10 to 15% growth in food prices. People are buying cheaper or less goods. So that's the kind of how they're managing their money as best they can within the realms of their control.
Yeah, thank you. So Jan, turning to you, when we see this increase in consumers having a problem paying, what do you at Klarna do to help or ease their struggle?
I think we do quite a lot. Of course, first and foremost, we do not want customers to make payments with payments or money which they do not have. That is the first thing. But of course, sometimes it makes sense to use credit, especially if you're buying something which is more expensive. But it need to be a fair and a sustainable credit model. So, and one of the things that we actually launched during last year was an internal initiative which we call Pink Standard, where it was very much about actually questioning ourselves and looking at our consumer offering and what we could improve there. So out of many things, what we did was that we removed some unnecessary fees. We introduced more friendly reminders in purpose trying to help customers to pay on time. We also prolonged the payment terms on Pay Later, the invoice product, from 14 to 30 days. Because that suits most consumers much better due to the fact that you get the salary most of the time once per month. And last but not least, what we also did was we took the decision of closing down our revolving credit. And the revolving credit is like a credit with not really an end date. And instead of that, we introduced what we call term loans, which actually have an end date. So, which is something I believe is more sustainable for consumers in general.
Great. And turning to you, Beatrice, what do you think companies in general can do to reduce consumers' bill anxiety?
Yeah, so I would say first and foremost to give your customers some pragmatic advice that they can act on. So help them regain control by giving this like actionable advice, and this can also help with people's financial well-being, because one of the best things to increase your financial well-being is to take control, to act, and feel that you do everything you can to manage your financial situation in the best way. I would also say that you could be proactive and reach out to your customers with a better deal instead of waiting for your customers to contact you for one. And then lastly, I would say that you sort of reorient your customer experience efforts and also your offers so that they meet your customers' like new needs, because because the financial situation have shifted for many people, and you should, as a company, shift your offers so that they meet the needs among your customers.
Thank you. And then taking a bit of a helicopter view, Anna, if we call this a bit of a crisis that we're in, how does this crisis compare to previous?
Yes.
What do you say?
So we've seen kind of our fair share of crises over the last 15 and 20 years. You know, we had the global financial crisis in 08-09, then we had the sovereign debt crisis in Europe, and then we had the pandemic. So, you know, within, let's say, 15, 20 years, we actually have seen 3 big crises. And now we have this energy or this living standard crisis. But what I think differentiates this one from the recent ones that we've experienced is really this rise in inflation and interest rates. This is something that we haven't seen for generation even. I mean, I think the closest thing that we can compare it to is really the energy crisis in the 70s. So many people were not even born at that time that we now currently make decisions about, you know, who are now consumers and are making decisions about their finances and how they spend their money. So I think we need to kind of adjust now and monitor the situation in a very different way than what we've been used to over the last 10, 15 years, just because we don't have experience dealing with those kind of situations.
So turning a bit more to the inflation, Eddie, how would you say you in Interim UK work to address customers in these financially vulnerable situations? What do you do?
From an Interim point of view, you know, our values are all about, you know, as a company, are all about ethics, empathy, dedication, solutions. So empathy is a real key word here. The key thing here is, you know, a wise man once told me we had 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, and you should use them in that priority, in that order. So listen to your customers. And we spend a lot of time training our frontline associates in being able to listen and use empathy. So all of our frontline are trained into identifying people who might have financial vulnerability. If they are, they will go through a kind of affordability assessment to make sure what situation they're in. And if they're in a difficult situation, we'll send them and we'll signpost them to people who can really give them real detailed advice on financial. If we think they are in a situation where we need to give them more help, so it might be mental or physical health underlying the root cause of why they're issue. We have a customer care team who are extremely well trained in understanding mental and physical health. We get trained by doctors, psychiatrists, psychologists on a regular basis, so they really understand how to talk to customers, how to listen to customers in their circumstances. So you need to make sure people are well trained to listen to customers and understand it. And the other thing is understanding root cause. So we've just recently rolled out financial abuse training because given the economic circumstances, we have started to see a rise in financial abuse. And that means that you need to understand what's going on. Is that the customer's saying some weird things? Do I need to understand actually they're being financially abused by a partner or something? That means I need to identify that and do something different with it. So really understand that, listening and making sure you understand and signpost to the right people if it's appropriate.
Yeah, and can you say anything about what groups are mostly suffering from the inflation?
I mean, sadly, the groups that's impacted most is those on a low income, as you would expect, because they spend the most part of their money they have on food and utility bills. Things like people who have multiple children, maybe living in adult children living in rented accommodation, we think are quite impacted by this. Potentially millennials, as unemployment starts to rise, as the kind of recessionary trends start to increase, as they have to kind of cut back their cost of their living because they're living at a means that they can't now afford, which is going to be an interesting thing. I think the other thing we should always remember, think about your own people, think about your own employees. Sometimes we forget, we deal with customers every day, but our employees are also can be customers. We've recently done some cost of living allowance for all our lower paid employees to try and mitigate the impact of the utility and food prices.
Okay, thank you, Eddie. Turning to you, Jan, then. Have you seen or noticed any behavioral shifts when it comes to consumers when they try to tackle the inflation?
Not really, not yet. But as always, when one talk about changes and especially in times of economic recessions, this is of course always very, very important. But and it's already been brought up a couple of times. But first of all, what I think one should do is to make a budget. That is absolutely necessary, and not because that gives you control about your fixed income, your fixed costs, and you will also see that most costs they are not split out evenly during the year, and that gives you some kind of control. The second thing which I will really emphasize is that not only doing a budget but also doing and questioning and following up of your cost, because actually we spend a lot of money on small stuff which we think it's very cheap and that doesn't cost us anything, but if we do that every day, it's quite often actually ends up with a quite big amount. And so by having control of the budget and your spendings, those are the two first and most important things. And the third one I would like to really emphasize is, especially for young people, is to build up a buffer. Because even if you do the budget and the planning in a proper way, there will always be, sooner or later, some unforeseen costs.
Yes.
And those you need to have some security around.
Very true. Our survey indicates that consumers are less willing, Anna was into that, to pay a premium for sustainable products. Is this something that you at Klarna see in your data or in your customer interactions?
Actually, not at all. I would say it's the opposite. I think everything around sustainability is more and more important. Even if you, independently if you talk about environmental or financial sustainability, maybe the financial sustainability has become more and more important now, especially those days. But I don't think that those two are in conflict, actually. I believe it's actually the opposite. Just looking at the electricity bills, for example, which we probably all of us try to save some money on our consumption of electricity, which of course have a positive impact on your financials. But it will hopefully, I'm not an expert, but I really believe that also has a positive impact on the environmental sustainability.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you. Let's turn a bit into financial literacy. Anna was into that, and I'd like to ask you, Beatrice, what challenges do you think are associated with poor financial literacy? And then I mean consumers' lack of understanding of basic financial terms.
Yeah, so having low financial literacy will make you less able to make confident and responsible decisions around your finances, budgeting, spending, saving, investing, etc. So, and it can also make people feel less confident in making these kind of decisions. So some might procrastinate on even making a choice. So they want to stay in this status quo and like not want to. They don't feel confident enough to make a decision. So so that can be kind of detrimental and kind of negative. And then also. Financial literacy is the economic foundation of financial well-being. So that is also very important to know that financial literacy can also impact how you feel around your money and your relationship to your financial situation. So also the feelings here is very important. So yeah.
And Anna, then you're a macroeconomic crisis expert here today. But how do you think this crisis will change the importance of financial literacy? You were a little bit into it, but can you elaborate on that?
Yes, I think, we've been spoiled, so to speak, to some extent, that over the last, as I mentioned before, 10, 15 years, we really had this environment of ultra low inflation, also interest rates. So people didn't really have to concern themselves with those kind of, terms or how inflation rates or interest rates are impacting their household budgets, just because it was such a small fraction and the borrowing costs. And I mean, general borrowing was so cheap. But as I said, even when we talk about normalization of interest rates and inflation, once we kind of are on the other side of this crisis and we emerged from it, the new normal will be still higher inflation interest rate than what we've been used to. So I think this financial literacy is becoming important. Also that, more and more people are actually investing their own money on, kind of stock markets. We have the cryptocurrencies, all those kind of new developments as well. So if people really want to make conscious decision and make sure that they, make appropriate investment and they maintain sustainable finances in the long run and also are able to save money for the comfortable retirement, I think this understanding and financial education is really high on the priority list. And I think this is something that really needs to be improved because it has been lacking over the last years.
And at Klarna, how do you think this can be resolved or helped? You do some initiatives, I know.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, I would like to say that I do not believe that there are any quick fixes for this, and because there are. It will be a long term and a joint effort among quite many players. And I think everything from government authorities to, of course, companies and schools and also the private individuals. We all have responsibilities for this. But at the same time, I do not believe that there is not one single company or authority that can fix everything. It's more about that everyone needs to do something. And to give you an example of what we did at Klarna starting this spring was that we targeted a group of people between 18 to 25 years old. And because, of course, they are more vulnerable for making some mistakes. So what we started to do then was to targeting this group with an educational movie the first time when they're making a purchase and trying to use one of our credit products. So we send out in the app and on email very short, but what we think quite good movie explaining what it actually means to buy on credit, but also what happens if you do not pay in terms of entering debt collection, legal action, and the risk of getting payment remarks. So that is one thing. We have also launched educational material for teachers and students, which is free of charge, and it's available on one of the school platforms. We also conducted a Nordic report among young people and asked them a lot of questions, how they look at private economy, how they look at savings, and how their education about private economy was when they were in school. There are some good examples, but there are also some worrying stuff there. So.
And I guess it's a great way of taking responsibility. And Eddie, turning to you at Intrum, we also do some stuff. What is your view on how can Intrum help?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important that as a large and responsible and ethical company in the credit management space, we play our part in educating customers and the future customers. So in Sweden, we run the Splendido digital tool for schools, which is about school children understanding how to use credit and what indebtedness means and how to use that well. In the UK, we go to local schools and we play a game about how credit works and how to use credit responsibly. Credit isn't necessarily a bad thing, but we need to understand how to use it wisely. And I think that's really important to get that over, and the budgeting tools and all that kind of stuff. So we teach people how to do that. The one thing we do know, and the survey says quite clearly, is there's a clear link between financial education and understanding what's going on in the world, and actually potentially outcomes. So I think the survey says 70% of people who had a poor financial education said they were worse off than they were 12 months ago. If you had a better education, that number falls to less than 50%. So financial education is really important. I think we have a big part to play in helping that in the scheme of things.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. That's a good note to end on. And I'm actually looking at the chat now, and we're having a few questions coming in. And I think the first one goes to you, Beatrice. Based on your experience, what could change customers' way of feeling for the better in these turbulent economic times?
Very good and important question. So I would say that if customers can feel some kind of hope and feel that even if the times are very tough now, that there will be better times afterwards, that the red light always turns green, and also if they feel that they have the power to make changes in their financial situation, so they so they feel that they can handle the situation. That would be, I think, some keys to make them feel better and be a bit more optimistic about the future.
Sounds sensible. Thank you, Beatrice. And then I think the next one goes to you, Jan. From your experience then, having worked within the debt collection industry, which target groups are more likely to make sustainable choices when it comes to shopping, despite gloomy times?
It's actually quite hard because of course we are following different KPIs in terms of, for example, the share of transactions that entering debt collection, and yes, it is true that in general young people have a high likelihood of ending up in debt collection. It is true, but I would say that the difference is even bigger when looking at gender. So if you do the same comparison, and then it's actually independently up until like 45 years old, men in general generate a higher share of transactions debt collection, which I also think is quite important actually to keep in mind when looking at those questions regarding literacy within the financial business. It can of course also have other answers. I'm only guessing now, I'm standing behind the expert here, but maybe the risk-taking appetite among men, I don't know. So, yeah, absolutely, there are differences, yes. But they are not that big.
Oh, interesting. Okay, by that I would like to thank you all for contributing to this interesting discussion. And we are running a bit out of time, and for people who have posted questions in the chat, we will come back individually to you and answer them. And by that, I just want to say tomorrow we release the European Consumer Payment Report. You will get an email, so look out in your inboxes where you will have a lot of data and insights to dig into. So thank you all for attending and have a great continuation of today.